I just built this little end table out of some plywood scrap that I had lying around the shop. I like it, the base is cool, but you should see the top. The top is made from epoxy resin and aquarium gravel. It's really cool. It kind of looks like stone countertops and it's really durable. Keep watching to see how easy it was to make. I made my tabletop form out of some melamine scrap that I had lying around the shop. I used a circular saw and my AccuCut to cut the panels down to size. I cut 2 1/4 inch wide strips to use as the side of my form, and a 16-inch square for the bottom. I pre-drilled through the sides and used 2 1/2-inch screws to hold the form together. Even with a nice and tight form, resin can still leak through the cracks, so it's important to seal all the junctions with silicone caulk. To estimate the amount of gravel that I would need, I just placed the bags in the open form. Looking back, it was actually way too much. I wish my ratios were a little different. I wish I would have used less gravel and more epoxy. I dumped 4 5-pound bags of aquarium gravel in a 5-gallon bucket. I checked to make sure my form was level before I started to fill it. Next, I mixed up my epoxy resin. The resin I used was a 50-50 ratio, 50% hardener, 50% resin. I used about 3 pints of each. Since this project was kind of an experimentation, I just used an inexpensive tabletop resin that I found at Home Depot. It actually ended up yellowing a little bit, so if I were to do this process over again, I probably would use a little bit higher quality resin. And like I mentioned, more of it. I mixed the resin according to the manufacturer's instructions. After I was done stirring for the appropriate amount of time, I poured my resin into the bucket with the gravel. Then, using a paddle mixer attachment for my drill, I mixed the two together. You liking what you see? Make sure to hit that like button. And while you're at it, subscribe to my channel. When I was sure all the gravel was covered in resin, I could dump out the mixture into the form. The resin is really messy and sticks to everything, so make sure you wear gloves. Once all the mixture was in the form, I used my hands to pat it into place, and then I used a trowel to smooth over the top. I took my time and made sure I worked out as many air pockets as I could. Once the top was smooth and level with the edges, I left it alone and allowed it to dry for 48 hours. The tabletop actually looked more like a giant Rice Krispie treat than a tabletop at this point, but I was excited to see what was inside the form. After removing the screws, I carefully used a chisel to pull away the sides. The bottom panel was a lot trickier and didn't want to separate from the resin as easily, but I was patient and I was able to eventually get the two to separate. I was instantly in love with how it turned out. I allowed the resin to continue to cure and then started on the plywood table base. All 4 sides of the base can come out of about half a sheet of plywood. The actual aesthetic of the table can be adjusted to whatever style you like. I like more clean lines and angles, so that's the design I drew up for each side. But if you're more into curvy or natural shapes, hey, go for it. I used a circular saw to cut a 45-degree miter on the outside edges of each leg. This was a little tricky, and if I had a nicer table saw, I probably would have used that instead. But I wanted to show you that it's possible, even with limited tools, to create something cool. The inside cuts of the legs are really simple, and they are just cut with the blade set at 90 degrees. To help get those perfectly straight lines, I cut as much as I could with my circular saw, and then I switched to a jigsaw to clean up the corners. I laid all 4 table legs across my workbench with the inside face up. I placed painter's tape on the back side of each seam and carefully aligned each panel so that my joints were as tight as possible. Then, I applied glue to the mitered edges of all 4 table legs. I relied on the tape to help hold everything together as I rolled all the panels together, and then I wrapped 2 ratchet straps around the table base to work as a clamp. Once the glue was dry, I removed the straps, applied edge banding, and gave the whole base a good sanding. I needed to create a support ledge for the tabletop to rest on. I cut some scrap 1x2 trim. Then I measured the thickness of my finished tabletop, added 1/16 of an inch, and used that measurement to create a marking from the top edge of the table legs so I know where my supports needed to be attached. I then sprayed 1 coat of primer and 3 coats of paint on the table base, making sure to sand with a 320 grit between each layer. While the paint dried on the table base, I turned my attention back to the tabletop. The melamine form left a really smooth but more of a satin finish to my resin, and I was looking for more of a high gloss shine. I wet sanded the surface of the tabletop from a 400 grit all the way up to a 2000 grit sandpaper. Then it was time to switch to automotive rubbing and buffing compound. Instead of buffing it by hand, I used my new Dremel Versa power cleaner. It's cordless and has plenty of power, so it made really quick work of buffing that resin to a high shine. Once the table base was fully dry, I could lower the top into place. I moved the end table where I wanted it, and then changed my mind and decided that it looked better set diagonally. I added some plants for a little bit of green, and then I found a good book. I think I'm definitely going to try both of these techniques again. The 4-piece table base was so simple, and I think there's so many potential design options. And I really love the way the rock and resin turned out. I played it safe, and the white aquarium rock really is kind of boring, but I love how it looks like stone countertops. So I think I'm going to try this again, but get a little bit more adventurous with the colors I choose. What else do you think would be cool embedded in resin? Make sure to tag that like button and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys!